Hi everyone, I am Rebecca from ChemKnits and welcome to night 3 of the 2024 Summer Mini Skein mini-series. Tonight is going to be all about glazing because as we are dyeing our yarn tonight in a yarn set of 5 colors that can be worked together in one project, we're going to try to have a different color of glaze on each of the minis. Now, what is glazed yarn? Often when we dye yarn, we submerge our yarn and then the dye sort of binds to the whole thing and we end up with a solid or semi-solid yarn. But when you're glazing, you submerge the yarn in a condition where the dyes will strike to the yarn so fast that it pretty much only hits the outside of the yarn, giving an effect where the yarn almost feels airbrushed. You feel like you can see what was originally there beneath the surface. And it's a really fun effect. I would never entirely describe glazing as being patchy because whenever I'm glazing yarn, the goal is to get some amount of coverage all over, but maybe it is patchy, but in a very ethereal kind of way. Today we're going to play with 3 different colors I know happen to glaze well. Dharma acid dyes in dark navy, royal purple, and pink orchid. When you're picking your dye for glazing, you want a color you know can strike really fast. If you pick a color like Caribbean blue or emerald green, then the color isn't going to bind as fast to the yarn, which means that you're not going to get that sort of surface level coverage. It's going to sink into the yarn more. So you want to pick the right dye, and I'm trying to set us up for success with the 3 colors I picked. And I think that we can make a really pretty pink through navy kind of colorway. And we're going to try to create some intermediate glazed colors. I don't know how this will work, but we're going to give it a shot. Now, before we go and start glazing in the conditions I most often use for glazing, I want to play around with these colors to make sure I have the proportions right with color mixing, so that way when we go ahead and try to glaze yarn in kettles, we know that I have the right proportion of the pink to purple, so that way we feel like we have a color in the middle versus having like the purple overwhelm the pink, which is more of a pastel. I put on my deluxe rubber respirator mask, safety glasses, and gloves so we could start measuring out our dye. When you're glazing yarn, a little bit of dye goes a long way because you want it to be concentrated on the outside of the yarn versus going through, and so you don't need to use that much pigment. Therefore, I decided to make 0.5% stock solutions, which have 1/2 gram of dye dissolved in 100 milliliters of water. So I measured out 1.25 grams of each of our 3 colors, dark navy, royal purple, and pink orchid, and then dissolved the dye into 250 milliliters of total volume. I very well could have started with 1% stock solutions here as well, but since I think I'm going to be playing with some smaller volumes overall, this is a way to help. Ultimately, the concentrations of your stock solution don't really matter as long as you're consistent with your calculations, if you're using calculations. One other thing I want to note is that royal purple has a pink in it that can crush out a solution and sometimes settle to the bottom of a stock solution. So you always want to make sure things are well mixed before you're distributing it. But that's the reason why for this project, I'm making smaller stocks to do for the tests, and then I'll make up new stocks when I plan to dye more of the yarn. Before attempting any glazing, I wanted to play around with the color mixing to make sure I had the ratios that I wanted. I started off with using the royal purple and dark navy at the same strength, the same depth of shade, and then having a 1-to-1 mixture of them in between. With the pink orchid, I started with more dye because that's what worked well for glazing in the past. And then when mixing the pink and the purple, I didn't add all the dye I thought I would add. I started with just half of the amount of pink and then a tiny amount of the purple, so that way I could play around with the color until I got something that felt like it was in between the 2. There's a chance I may want to make the navy darker, but we'll see how all this looks. So now we have our 1 cup of water, no acid, our dye, and I started adding our 20-gram mini skeins to each of the containers and let it sit for a little bit so we could try to absorb that color. My tap water is slightly acidic, but I'm not anticipating we'll end up with something that feels glazed here, but you never know, we might be surprised. I was really, really happy with the way these colors turned out, even knowing that sometimes colors like navy can look a little bit more purple until you add heat, but setting things up cold with no acid, it was a great first start. I let things sit for 10 minutes just at room temperature, and then came and added 1 teaspoon of white vinegar to each container, stirred things up, and then I wanted to use these same proportions for a second test. I set up 5 more cups with 1 cup of water, the same amount of dyes as I used on the first round. But this time I added 2 tablespoons of white vinegar to each of the containers before coming in and adding the yarn. I was curious if I could get a glazed effect on our yarn, starting cold at room temperature, doing some kind of cool vat processing. And the reason why I was curious about this is that when I do glazing, the technique that has worked best with me is to start cold with high acid, a huge volume of water, and then to heat it up, and then I end up with a lovely glazed effect. Now, in these kinds of containers, we have a low volume of water, so when I add the yarn in, some of that dye is probably going to get pushed through the skein of yarn, which means maybe it's not going to be just at the surface. So we may not end up with glazing here. We may end up with something that feels just as tonal as our first set, which is okay. But I'm curious if this works for future purposes. And as I'm looking at all these colors, I'm struck by the intensity of the color that I feel. And also the fact that I probably could have just done a gradient with navy and pink orchid, but since I know royal purple is really excellent as a glazing dye, that's why I wanted to incorporate it into the mix. But it really does feel like I mixed just 2 dyes together versus 3 different colors. To give things a fighting chance to actually get a bit of a glaze, I dunked the yarn in some plain tap water before adding it into the container, realizing I probably should have squeezed out a little bit. At least one of the containers might be a little too full for when I put the lid on. But my thought is that if the yarn is already full of water, the dye I want to glaze with can't go all the way to the center of the skein as easily. That dye is going to come more in contact with the surface. So I crossed my fingers and we set a timer to sit and wait before moving anything and to hopefully just trust the process. The navy did look odd, but over time it does turn more navy when it's coming in contact with the yarn. I think just with acid that color looks a little odd. As we're waiting an hour, I have another thought. One thing I could have done here is I could have dunked the yarn in water that already had acid. That maybe would have helped things, but the reason why I'm curious if I can do a cold process glaze is that that would make things a lot easier as I go and try to scale this up versus waiting a long time for a kettle to heat up and starting from a cold dye bath each time. Not that that would be a huge problem, but if this does work, then that's really, really cool. It's been an hour and I'll say honestly things look promising. It looks like I'm seeing some glazing, at least in the navy. I don't want to touch the yarn, but I do feel an unevenness. I don't know about the pink though. That's looking a little more even, but it'll be harder to say. So I'm gonna place lids on these containers and we're gonna set them aside at least overnight to see what happens. I'm not stirring them again because I don't want to agitate things any more than is necessary. Yeah, that one's a little full, but we'll just wait to see what happens. Maybe the cold process is working, maybe it's not working, but since I have the dye, I thought that I'd set up some different containers so we can have some sort of gradients of our navy, royal purple, and pink orchid. And we're ranging here from between a 2% depth of shade to a 0.1% depth of shade, depending on the color. I will pop the amounts of dye that I'm adding and the depth of shade that the color will be up on the screen as I'm filling these up. Each container started with 1 cup of water After adding the dye, I added 2 tablespoons of white vinegar, and then I did pop the mini skeins into some plain tap water, squeezed out, so it's still very saturated, but there's some water left in there before transferring the yarn into the dye. Then I popped on the lids and set everything aside for a couple of days. Oh no! With the navy, I had everything set up and I totally forgot to dunk the skeins first. Whoops! I'll try to do that for the other colors. It's hard doing this now because I don't know if the cold glazing attempt really worked, but this will give us just a tad more information before we go and decide how we're gonna scale things up and play around with this on multiple different types of yarn bases. With this little bit of leftover dye that I have from these prototypes, I thought that I would quickly demonstrate on some full skeins why I like to do a cold start with glazing. Even though that seems counterintuitive because you want the dyes to strike really, really fast onto the yarn. But one problem I would have when I would start hot with high acid and high heat is that the color I wanted to glaze with wouldn't distribute very well all over the entire skein. The colors would strike so fast that I wouldn't get good coverage, and so then I'd want to maybe do it again, and that was something I was struggling with. So if I start with everything cold and high acid, then I get the colors more evenly distributed around the skein. Of course, a more patchy glaze can also be lovely, but that wasn't always the effect that I was going for. In the dye pot, I started with 24 cups of water, 1 cup of white vinegar, and then I started with the pink before moving on to the purple and then the navy. Pink orchid is a color where sometimes if you try to layer it on, it strikes really unevenly, even cold with acid, so that's something to consider. Of course, you could always start hot and do multiple rounds of glazing and putting the yarn in, and so there are other ways that you could vary this a little bit more. But anyway, this is also just a fun attempt at a layered glazed colorway. The yarn bases are Crazy 8 worsted, which is 100% superwash merino, and then Stroll, which is 75% superwash merino, 25% nylon. I moved on to the next color once it looked like most of the color in the pot had absorbed, and then after the navy I let things heat for 30 minutes before removing the yarn, turning off the heat, and washing the yarn off camera. 2 days later, I'm ready to look at our prototypes. All of the containers had the same amount of dye, but this top row is the row where I started with no acid, so we got more coverage of the color on the yarn. And then here I started with a more glazing setup with high acid before I added the yarn. And now I'm gonna remove all the yarn so that way we can take a closer look. The biggest surprise to me is that we still have color left in this container when we had more acid in here than we have in here. So that just surprises me a little bit, but certainly soaking the skeins a bit and putting them in with high acid gave us colors that are less even. I'm gonna quickly reorganize the yarn. I do feel elements of glazing in each of those 5 skeins. Maybe a little bit less in the pink, but I think that the contrast between the effects we got with starting with acid, you can certainly tell that these are more tonal and these are more solid. Even though there's tonal variation in these skeins as well, there is a bigger difference if you add the yarn to a cold dye bath with acid in it already versus not. I potentially could have stirred things a little bit more, but I think that for scaling up and for the tests that I want to try around with, I think that we'll go ahead and do it in a kettle so we can have that larger volume of water, because I feel like that is important. I am going to heat set all of this yarn for 30 minutes, and we'll take a look at the rest of the cold process yarn we set up. The amount of dye that you use when you're trying to glaze yarn is really important as well. If you use too much dye, then you might not be able to feel that glazed effect on the yarn because there's going to be so much dye that it's got to bind somewhere, that you'll overload the color and have something that feels more solid and less airbrushed. We'll take a closer look once the yarn is dry because you feel that contrast more with dry yarn. But I would say for the navy and the purple, the lightest 2 depths of shade both look glazed, and then things look a lot more solid. With the pink, the lightest 4 look glazed, to me from this setup. And I don't think pre-dunking the skein before adding it into the dye bath made a huge difference between the navy and the purple, but maybe it did make some difference. A few of these containers have dye left in there, especially where we're getting to the 2% depth of shade of the navy and purple, and a few of the lighter navies as well. So I took these containers and steamed them in a sort of double boiler setup in my steamer basket until all that dye had cleared. Everything else I steam set for 30 minutes. I just dyed a 2% depth of shade of dark navy, and I was heat setting it in this container, and it's like red. It's almost like a rust color, and I believe dark navy is a primary from Dharma, and so there's only one pigment molecule in there. But I do know that navy, when you add acid to it before you've added the yarn, sometimes it turns this very like maroon color, even though it then looks very navy on the yarn. So have you ever observed this before? Can you tell me what's going on? I'm truly perplexed, unless maybe it was too hot. I have no idea. I washed all of the cooled off yarn in some cold water with a little bit of dish soap, and thankfully there was no color bleeding. I wasn't expecting any bleeding on our multicolored sets, but our depth of shade steps that had pretty saturated skeins, I thought that there was a chance there could be some, but again, we saw none. So I put the yarn through my spin dryer and hung it up to dry. Now we're coming for the test that I really wanted to do, that I didn't even mention in the introduction. But we're gonna try glazing yarn with similar fiber content, but with different numbers of plies. There are many different ways that yarn can have twist and number of plies, but sometimes the higher twist a yarn is, the easier it is to get a good glaze on there. So I was just curious, if I dyed everything all at once, if I would notice any difference between having 1, 2, 3, 4, or 8 plies on yarn. And also a yak blend, because I want to test to see if I can see a glaze on this yarn base or not. I pre-soaked all of this yarn in some plain tap water with no acid, and then went to go set up the dye and everything I would need to start glazing it. Off camera, I made some fresh 1% dye stocks of our pink orchid, royal purple, and dark navy acid dyes. Of course, while wearing my respirator mask, safety glasses, and gloves. Next, I started preparing my dye baths. Each started with 20 cups of cool tap water, about 1.5 cups or 750 milliliters of white vinegar, and I'm using 5% acetic acid vinegar. And then the amount of dye that I'll put up on the screen next to each kettle that you see me loading up here. But there are around 60 to 100 milliliters of dye total for 240 grams of yarn that I'm dyeing in these kettles. In addition to the yarn that I showed that I'll be dyeing for each of these rounds, I'm dyeing some other skeins because I'm curious how they'll glaze, just for a side-by-side comparison, but I'll talk about those towards the end. After adding the acid and the dye to the kettle, I stirred things up and then brought over our yarn, adding the yarn, giving it a quick stir, and then immediately transferring the kettle onto my stove, where I brought it up to a boil and heat for 30 minutes. And I'm assuming that the dye dissolved in that time, and if it didn't, maybe I would let it heat for longer or cool off in the pot. I'm attempting to separate this so that way I show you I meant to add 1.5 cups of white vinegar, and silly me can't do math while I'm measuring out things very well. So instead of doing 375 milliliters, which would be about 1.5 cups, I did 475 milliliters. So we probably have a lot more acid in the kettle than we need, but it shouldn't hurt anything. Even the Selena I have boiled in 100% vinegar, so 5% acetic acid, and haven't had any issues. So everything should be fine. I wanted to create a sock blank that was roughly inspired by this concept of blending colors for custom glazes. So I took 40 milliliters of our pink orchid dye and dip dyed 2 double-stranded sock blanks into that. One was a hawthorn blank, one was a stroll blank. Once all or most of the pink dye had absorbed, I removed the blanks and then added 20 milliliters of our royal purple dye stock and dip dyed the other end until I had absorbed the majority of that purple color. We have really high acid in this dye bath, so we may or may not get glaze from these dip dyes, but I'm expecting that we will probably get some. Finally, I took 50 milliliters of our dark navy dye, added that to the dye pot, stirred things up, and then quickly added the blanks to the warm dye bath and let things finish absorbing, and I let it heat for 30 minutes. And so this isn't the same color progression as we did with our mini skeins because we're covering up all of the pink and purple with navy, but I thought it was a fun way to do things. I decided to dye one more round of sock blanks based on a video that'll come out later this summer, but using these same 3 colors. I arranged a stroll and hawthorn double-stranded sock blank in my catering steam pan and then covered it with one of the leftover dye baths from another round of glazing. So don't forget that this already had a ton of acid in there. Then off camera, I measured out approximately 0.3 grams of our pink orchid and between 0.15 and 0.17 grams each of dark navy and royal purple. I dissolved each of these 3 colors separately in a cup and a half of water. And then when our dye bath was warm, I brought them over and poured them on, knowing that we might have some area that's not glazed, but we'll probably have a lot of area that is glazed. Because by adding the dye in a larger volume of water, that's going to allow it to spread more and sort of settle onto our blank. I did help with a spoon to sort of move the colors around and through a little bit, but mostly try to let things go where they would, and then I heat the blanks for 30 minutes before letting everything cool off and washing them off camera. The yarn is dry, and let's twist up some minis. Just look at the difference that having high acid versus no acid when you start can make when you're doing a cold process dyeing. Here we have a gradient of glazes where we have, yes, tonal variation, but also low color penetration. And here we have more tonals, more semi-solid colorways, because we started with lower acid. Now, glaze doesn't necessarily mean that we have this much tonal variation in here, but it does have a more airbrushed feel versus being more all over. And I'm super glad this side-by-side worked. When I took a look at the depths of shade of royal purple, dark navy, and pink orchid, part of what I was hoping to determine was the best depth of shade for glazing. Because certainly if you're at a 2% depth of shade, that's way too much dye, you're not going to see a glaze. And even though with the navy, I know I didn't set up the conditions perfectly for glazing, I think that the concentration that we're actually using is one of the best, because you add a little too much dye, then you don't get that contrast. And so I think things are actually pretty good. And I mean, I know they're really good because of the way we blended the colors, and that looked really good, but it's always just nice to have a little confirmation. I think this is the most I've ever had a stroll sock blank unravel on me. There are a number of yards here that are unraveled. And mainly that comes from dip dyeing. Once you get a little bit unraveling, the weight of the yarn, if it's still in the water, will pull, and then just the dip dyeing pressure will unravel more. You can add a safety line to your blank beforehand if you want to avoid this, which maybe I should have done. So I'm probably going to go and finish unraveling this blank, and I will insert some pictures of it here for you. Dip dyeing our blanks in pink and then purple, followed by a navy glaze, gave an extremely subtle gradient, but we do still have a gradient here. It's just a bit of a variegated gradient. And we can tell from, if I pull this apart, and you can see that white in there, the color struck fast. We will have reverse speckling in here, which will give us a beautiful mottled effect. This second glazed attempt worked so well. So much better than the video you haven't seen where I tried to do a variegated glazed look in an immersion pan. In the purple section, there are some deeper areas that are less glazed, likely because I didn't spread that dye as much as I did with the pink and the navy. But if we zoom in on some of the other areas, you can see that light airbrushed effect, and I'm thrilled. Now that all these prototypes are done, it's time for us to go and dye up some more yarn. And if you're curious what glazing, or sort of attempting a glaze layer of these three colors, one on top of the other, does, check out these two beautiful bonus skeins. I think the easiest thing for me to do to compare the number of plies glazed will be to twist them up first. So that's what I'm gonna do. Let's take a closer look. All 6 of the yarn bases glazed well in all 5 colors, which is pretty awesome. And I'm also really impressed, again, that there's not breaking when we mixed the pink and purple or the purple and navy. So that's just pretty cool. Now, as for the ply number, the distribution of dye seems to be fairly even, with the exception of the single ply yarn and the 3 ply yarn. Those two seemed to absorb a little bit less. They feel just a little bit less pigmented than the others. And this is something that's a little bit more apparent on the navy and maybe the second color. And I don't think it's just how they twisted. That's sort of a gut feel I got as I was twisting the yarn. Krypton is a little bouncier. It's maybe the plies are a little more high twist than either platinum or titanium. And also I think the sourcing of it is different. So it could come down to the fiber content and not just the ply number. But anyway, I have to pose this to you. Do you have a favorite here? The biggest conclusion that I have, though, is the thicker the ply, the easier it is to get a glaze. So the easiest yarn to get a glaze on is that single ply yarn, just because you have the resist from the yarn itself. And a high twist yarn like Crazy 8 can still glaze really well, even though you have a lot thinner plies overall. But the single ply is the easiest. And so that's just worth keeping in mind if you have a colorway you want to glaze, but you're struggling to glaze. However, you can glaze all these different blends, and that's really exciting. Speaking of blends, I did also glaze a blend that had stellina in it. The stellina shouldn't make a difference, except for the fact that you can see that it is still sparkly even after being in the high acid environment. But we also successfully glazed the silk blend and our superwash MCN yarn, and so that's really exciting. One base that I didn't highlight during the segment was our yak blend, and that glazed super well too. You can glaze over just about anything, but today I've been trying to show it off over the bare yarn color because that gives us the most contrast. Actually, I don't know if that's the most contrast over white, because you get more contrast if you do a color that's a different bright. But anyway, we got glazing on the yak as well. When you're dyeing a mix of fiber types all in one kettle, some yarn might absorb more of a color, or in this case, it could absorb more of one of the pigments than the other, which is really clear when we see how much lighter, for example, the merino silk blend is compared to the rest of the yarn. Of course, if a merino silk blend absorbs the exact same amount of dye, it looks lighter anyway, so there's that as well. But this is not the best depth of shade comparison between these different fiber types because, again, they were dyed all at the same time and they may have absorbed different amounts of dye. I think there was a point where I described this year's SMSMS, this summer mini skein mini series, as about measuring, but I really think it's more about planning and comparisons. And we certainly have a lot of comparisons that I did here today. And honestly, of all of the different fiber contents that I'm offering this year as mini skein sets, all of them glazed well. And that is pretty amazing if you take a moment and think about it. And yes, there are yarn bases where it'll be easier and harder to glaze. If you had something that was non-superwash, I think it would be extremely difficult to get a glaze there. Not impossible, just difficult because, again, you want to make your conditions such that the dyes will strike to the iron really, really quickly. And unfortunately, this can't be done with every single color. I mean, how cool would it be if, I haven't ever tried to glaze with yellow, but it would be so hard to see because yellow doesn't contrast much with other colors. I've glazed with the pink orchid on top of yellow in the past, and that looks really, really cool. It would be amazing if you could do glazes with some greens, and one green that maybe I should try is forest green, which is more of a really deep teal. And I think that one could have some potential, but I haven't tried that yet. So if you want to see some more glazing content, please subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss a new video. I have been on a journey with all of my dyeing adventures, and in particular glazing. If you go back, there is a whole glazing playlist, and just watch some of the earliest videos. You can watch me evolve, and doing series like this really give me the opportunity to play around with different techniques or recipes and really give things a shot that maybe I wouldn't have otherwise. And I come away from doing a video like this feeling so much more confident in what I can achieve, especially on that diamond sock, that silk blend. Whew, that one surprised me. That one surprised me a lot. Now, I absolutely adore how this colorway came out. And I thought it would be fun to create a version of this colorway on some full skeins. So there is a dyed to order listing where you can pick the yarn base and get a 500 gram set of this glazed colorway that I created tonight. You can find more information in the ChemKnits Creations Etsy shop. And there may also be some mini skein sets, including some versions from tonight, which is night 3. Feel free to send me a message on Etsy if you're curious if I have night 3 in a particular yarn base. I'm not sure yet if I'm going to update the listing. Probably by night 5 I'll update the listing to show which nights I have left of which bases. But if I'm going to do that, I don't think I would do that until all of the nights have come out. However, at this stage, I'm happy to go check. Any dyed to order listings as part of the Summer Mini Skein mini-series will be available for a limited time, and I'll include all details about that and how long they're available in the item descriptions in my Etsy shop. But I am so excited about the possibilities we have here. Oh man, and yeah, I now am feeling so much more confident and really want to just glaze all of the things. But glazing is not on the table for tomorrow night's colorway. Do you have any ideas what I will be dyeing up? Let me know in the comments below, and I will see you back here tomorrow night at 8:30 p.m. Eastern Time for night 4 of the 2024 Summer Mini Skein mini-series. Thank you so much for watching.